Sometimes the smallest act of disrespect becomes the moment that changes an entire life. The afternoon sun hung high above Franklin Square Park, casting bright reflections across the rows of folding tables where volunteers handed out cold bottled water to anyone struggling through another sweltering summer day. The temperature had climbed past 95 degrees, and families gathered beneath scattered oak trees searching for shade while children laughed around the splash fountain nearby. Naomi Carter moved quietly from person to person, offering chilled bottles of water with the same gentle smile she gave everyone, whether they wore expensive business clothes or carried everything they owned inside worn backpacks. She never asked questions. She simply believed that kindness should never depend on appearances. A small line had formed near her folding table as elderly residents, construction workers, and parents with young children accepted bottles with grateful smiles. Everything felt peaceful until the distant sound of a police utility vehicle rolled across the parking lot. Officer Ethan Brooks stepped out wearing a neatly pressed Navy patrol uniform, dark sunglasses shielding his eyes from the blazing sunlight. After more than 20 years in law enforcement, he had developed complete confidence in his instincts. He believed he could identify trouble within seconds, often before anyone else even noticed it. As he surveyed the gathering from several yards away, he saw coolers, folding tables, and a crowd slowly growing larger. Without stopping to ask questions, he assumed the event had not been authorized. He walked toward the center of the park with quick, purposeful strides while nearby conversations slowly faded into uneasy silence. Naomi noticed the officer approaching and immediately smiled in greeting, lifting one unopened bottle of water. "Would you like some cold water, officer?" she asked politely. Ethan barely acknowledged the gesture. His attention remained fixed on the crowd surrounding her table. "Who gave you permission to set this up?" he asked in a firm voice. Naomi answered calmly. "We are providing free water because of the heat advisory. We have been here since this morning." Ethan glanced briefly at the coolers, but never looked at the paperwork neatly resting inside a transparent folder on the table. Instead, convinced that immediate action was necessary, he reached for the department-issued portable water sprayer stored inside his patrol vehicle, equipment commonly carried during extreme summer events for crowd cooling and public safety demonstrations. Before anyone fully understood what he intended, he activated a broad, cooling mist directly across the front of Naomi's table, soaking the stacked cases of bottled water, dampening her business blouse and jacket, and sending lightweight paper information sheets drifting across the grass. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Several children stopped playing. Volunteers rushed to keep the supplies from falling while elderly visitors stepped backward in confusion. Naomi closed her eyes for only a brief second as cool water ran from her sleeves onto the pavement. She neither shouted nor argued. She simply bent down and began gathering the scattered papers one by one. A young boy hurried over to help her, followed by an older veteran carrying a cane. Around them, dozens of smartphones slowly rose into the air as witnesses instinctively began recording what they had just seen. Ethan remained convinced he had acted appropriately, unaware that every second was now being preserved from multiple angles. Naomi quietly thanked the little boy for helping, placed the damp papers back inside her folder, and gently reassured the worried volunteers that everything would be fine. The only sound left in the park was the steady dripping of water onto the concrete walkway, while every person watching sensed they had just witnessed the beginning of something far greater than an ordinary misunderstanding. Only a few minutes earlier, the park had looked completely different. Before curious eyes gathered and phones began recording. Before confusion replaced conversation, Naomi Carter had arrived just after 8 o'clock that morning with 2 volunteers and the same quiet determination that had guided nearly every weekend of her adult life. She had parked her aging silver crossover beside the community pavilion, unloaded folding tables, portable coolers, and dozens of sealed cases of bottled water before the heat settled over the city. The National Weather Service had warned residents that temperatures would climb into dangerous territory before noon, and Naomi knew exactly who would suffer first. Elderly neighbors living alone, people experiencing homelessness, delivery drivers walking long routes, construction crews, and families who could not afford to spend the afternoon inside air-conditioned buildings often relied on community organizations during days like these. She never viewed the event as charity. To her, It was simply neighbors helping neighbors. Naomi had spent more than 10 years working with nonprofit organizations across the city, organizing food drives, school supply donations, neighborhood cleanups, and emergency cooling stations whenever extreme weather arrived. She had learned long ago that people rarely remembered who donated the supplies, but they always remembered how someone made them feel during difficult moments. That belief shaped every conversation she had. She greeted everyone with the same warm smile, spoke patiently, and never rushed anyone away from the table. Even those who insisted they did not need help often left carrying an extra bottle for someone else. Her volunteers admired that about her. She noticed people others overlooked. Earlier that morning, she had quietly filled a reusable water bottle for an elderly veteran who admitted he had forgotten his medication because the heat had made him dizzy. A few minutes later, she helped a pregnant woman find a shaded bench beneath a large oak tree before offering cold water to the woman's young son. She even stopped to refill a park maintenance worker's insulated bottle after watching him collect overflowing trash bins beneath the blazing sun. Every interaction felt ordinary because Naomi never expected recognition. She believed kindness worked best when it remained simple. Before leaving her apartment that morning, she had carefully placed several city documents inside a transparent folder resting beneath the table. The permits approving the hydration station, volunteer registration forms, emergency contact information, and written authorization from the city's Department of Community Health had all been organized in perfect order. She always prepared thoroughly because experience had taught her that organization protected both volunteers and the people they served. Her closest friends often teased her for carrying extra copies of every document imaginable, and Naomi would simply laugh before saying that preparation created peace of mind. What almost nobody standing in Franklin Square Park realized was that Naomi's calm confidence did not come from believing problems would never happen. It came from knowing she could face unexpected moments without losing her character. That quiet strength had been shaped years earlier while caring for her late mother through a long illness. During those difficult seasons, Naomi discovered that patience often accomplished far more than anger ever could. She carried that lesson into every part of her life. As the afternoon heat intensified and the damp papers slowly dried beneath the sunlight after the unexpected spray of water, the volunteers watched Naomi continue arranging bottles across the table exactly as she had before the interruption. She thanked each person who offered assistance, smiled reassuringly at worried families, and never once spoke with bitterness. The gathering crowd could not understand how someone treated so unfairly remained so composed, but Naomi understood something they did not. Character revealed itself most clearly when dignity became more difficult to protect than pride. While the growing crowd continued watching Naomi quietly restore order to the hydration station, Officer Ethan Brooks believed he had prevented a problem before it could grow larger. He stood several yards away with his arms folded, observing the volunteers as if expecting someone to challenge his authority. None of them did. Ethan had spent 22 years wearing the same badge, and during that time he had built a reputation as an officer who acted quickly and rarely questioned his own judgment. His supervisors often described him as dependable, disciplined, and decisive. Fellow officers respected his willingness to make difficult decisions without hesitation. Over time, however, confidence had slowly transformed into certainty, and certainty had become something far more dangerous. Ethan had stopped asking himself whether his first impression might be wrong. He believed experience alone could tell him everything he needed to know about a situation within seconds. Earlier that morning, his shift had begun before sunrise with the routine patrol briefing at the precinct. Officers reviewed traffic concerns, neighborhood events, and the city's excessive heat advisory before dispersing across their assigned districts. Franklin Square Park appeared on the daily activity list because several community organizations had requested permits for outdoor events during the weekend. Ethan remembered hearing the announcement, but the details barely registered in his mind as other priorities competed for his attention. By late morning, he had already responded to several routine service calls, directed traffic around a construction zone, and checked on an elderly resident after neighbors requested a wellness visit. Nothing unusual had happened, yet the relentless heat made everyone less patient, including Ethan himself. As the hours passed, he found himself becoming increasingly suspicious of anything that appeared unexpected. When he first drove past Franklin Square Park, what caught his attention was not the families enjoying the shade or the volunteers distributing water. His eyes focused immediately on the growing crowd gathered around Naomi's table. In his mind, large gatherings often created problems before solutions. He noticed the coolers, but assumed they had appeared without authorization. He noticed people lining up, but never considered that they might simply be seeking relief from dangerous temperatures. Most importantly, he noticed Naomi standing confidently at the center of the activity, and without realizing it, he allowed unconscious assumptions to fill the gaps where facts should have been. Rather than approaching with curiosity, he approached with conclusions already formed. Ethan sincerely believed he was protecting public order. He never imagined that his own haste might become the real disturbance. As he watched Naomi calmly continue handing bottles of water to strangers despite everything that had just happened, he interpreted her composure as quiet defiance instead of remarkable restraint. Around him, conversations among the witnesses grew softer, but their expressions changed. Parents comforted confused children. An elderly couple exchanged disappointed glances. Several volunteers continued organizing supplies while occasionally looking toward Ethan with visible disbelief. He noticed the smartphones still pointed in his direction, but dismissed them without concern. In his years as an officer, members of the public recorded police interactions almost every day. Most videos faded from public attention within hours. He assumed this moment would be no different. What Ethan did not know was that one local television journalist happened to be walking through the park on her lunch break. Standing beneath a maple tree near the walking path, she quietly continued recording every detail, unaware that the next few minutes would begin changing not only one officer's career, but also the relationship between an entire police department and the community it had sworn to serve. The humid afternoon air seemed heavier with every passing minute as whispers spread through Franklin Square Park faster than the faint breeze moving the tree branches overhead. The unexpected encounter had interrupted the peaceful rhythm of the community event, yet Naomi Carter refused to allow the atmosphere to become one of anger. She carefully straightened the folding table, wiped away the remaining drops of water, and continued placing chilled bottles within easy reach of anyone who needed one. Her volunteers watched her closely, almost waiting for permission to express the frustration they were clearly feeling. But Naomi simply offered each of them an encouraging smile. "People still need water," she said softly. "That has not changed." Those few words immediately redirected everyone's attention back to the reason they had gathered in the first place. A young mother approached with two exhausted children whose cheeks had turned bright red from the afternoon heat. Naomi knelt slightly to hand each child a cold bottle before reminding them to stay in the shade whenever possible. Nearby, an elderly man struggled to carry a reusable shopping bag while balancing a cane. Without hesitation, Naomi walked around the table, lifted the heavy bag with one hand, and escorted him toward a nearby bench beneath a large oak tree. The crowd noticed every small gesture. They also noticed that she never once looked toward Officer Ethan Brooks with resentment. Ethan remained near his patrol vehicle, watching the scene unfold with growing uncertainty. He had expected the volunteers to argue with him, expected someone to challenge his authority or create a public confrontation. Instead, Naomi behaved as though helping people remained more important than defending her pride. That unexpected response unsettled him far more than any argument could have. One of the volunteers quietly picked up the transparent folder containing the damp city permits and placed it back on the table. The papers inside were still readable despite being wet. A local business owner stepped forward after recognizing Naomi from previous neighborhood improvement projects. "Miss Carter, do you need fresh copies printed?" he asked kindly. Naomi thanked him but gently declined, explaining that everything would dry soon enough. Her calm confidence slowly influenced everyone around her. Conversations became quieter. Expressions softened. The emotional energy that could have exploded into confrontation instead settled into thoughtful silence. Across the walkway, the local television journalist continued recording while occasionally interviewing witnesses who described what they had seen only minutes earlier. None of them exaggerated the events. They simply repeated the same observation. Naomi had remained respectful from beginning to end. Several bystanders uploaded short clips to social media. where comments began appearing almost immediately from residents who recognized the familiar community volunteer distributing water every summer. Meanwhile, Ethan's police radio crackled with routine dispatch traffic, briefly pulling his attention away before another message arrived requesting a status update from his location. He responded that everything was under control. From his perspective, the situation appeared calm. What he did not realize was that the story had already traveled far beyond the boundaries of Franklin Square Park. Inside City Hall, a staff member scrolling through local community updates paused after recognizing Naomi in one of the newly uploaded videos. Within moments, a phone call was placed to a senior official who immediately recognized both the event and the woman standing quietly beside the folding table. Less than 15 minutes later, two black sport utility vehicles pulled away from the municipal building toward the park. No flashing lights announced their arrival. No urgency appeared from the outside. Yet the people inside those vehicles carried information that would soon transform an ordinary summer afternoon into a moment that nobody standing beneath those trees would ever forget. The quiet murmur of the crowd gradually shifted into complete silence as two black sport utility vehicles turned slowly into the park entrance and came to a smooth stop near the walking path. Nobody recognized the vehicles at first, but several people instinctively stepped aside while others lowered their phones for a better view. Officer Ethan Brooks straightened his posture, assuming another city department had arrived to address the growing attention surrounding the community event. The first vehicle door opened, and Police Chief Michael Reynolds stepped onto the pavement with a composed expression that immediately caught Ethan by surprise. The chief rarely appeared at routine neighborhood calls without advance notice. A second door opened moments later, and City Manager Rebecca Lawson emerged carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. She scanned the park for only a moment before her eyes settled on Naomi Carter. Without hesitation, she walked directly toward her with a warm smile. "Naomi, I am so sorry you had to experience this," Rebecca said sincerely as she reached out to shake her hand. Naomi returned the greeting with the same calm dignity she had shown everyone else that afternoon. "Thank you for coming," she answered quietly. Police Chief Reynolds approached only a step behind Rebecca. He looked briefly at the damp paperwork resting inside the transparent folder before turning back toward Naomi. "We received the video almost immediately," he said. "Are you all right?" Naomi nodded gently. "I am fine. The volunteers are fine. We simply wanted to continue serving the community." Ethan watched the conversation unfold with growing confusion. He had never seen senior city officials greet an ordinary volunteer with such familiarity or respect. His uncertainty deepened when Rebecca opened the leather portfolio and carefully removed an official city folder bearing the municipal seal. She smiled as she handed it to Naomi. "I was hoping we would present this during next week's council meeting," she said. "But after what happened today, I think everyone here deserves to know." Naomi accepted the folder without any sign of celebration. She seemed almost reluctant to draw attention to herself. Rebecca turned toward the gathering crowd before speaking clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Many of you know Naomi because of her years of service to this city," she began. "What most people do not know is that beginning next month, she will become the executive director of the city's Office of Community Partnership and Public Trust." Quiet surprise spread across the park. Rebecca continued. "She was selected after a nationwide search because of her extraordinary leadership, integrity, and ability to build trust between public institutions and the communities they serve. One of her primary responsibilities will be working directly with every city department, including the police department, to strengthen relationships through training, education, and community engagement." Ethan felt the color drain from his face. The realization arrived slowly but completely. The woman he had judged within seconds without asking a single meaningful question was someone the city had spent months recruiting to improve exactly the kind of relationship he represented. Around him, witnesses exchanged quiet glances, not with satisfaction, but with disbelief that such a misunderstanding had unfolded so publicly. Naomi looked toward Ethan for the first time since the city officials had arrived. There was no anger in her expression, no desire to embarrass him before the crowd. She simply offered the same calm look she had given every stranger who had accepted a bottle of water that afternoon. That unexpected kindness weighed far more heavily on Ethan than any criticism ever could. The excitement that had swept across Franklin Square Park slowly faded into an almost unexpected stillness. The afternoon sun remained high, yet the atmosphere felt completely different from only a few minutes earlier. The scattered drops of water on the pavement had nearly evaporated beneath the relentless heat, leaving behind only faint marks that would disappear before sunset. Volunteers quietly resumed handing out bottles of water while families returned to shaded benches, but conversations were softer now, filled with reflection instead of surprise. Naomi Carter stood beside the folding table with the official city folder resting gently beneath her hand, although she made no effort to display it. She seemed far more interested in making sure an elderly woman received a cold bottle of water than explaining her new position to anyone nearby. Police Chief Michael Reynolds watched her for a moment before speaking quietly to City Manager Rebecca Lawson. "That is exactly why the selection committee chose her," he said. "She never makes the work about herself." Rebecca nodded in agreement. Leadership reveals itself long before someone receives a title. A few yards away, Officer Ethan Brooks remained motionless beside his patrol vehicle. For the first time in many years, he found himself replaying every decision he had made that afternoon. The memory arrived with uncomfortable clarity. Naomi had greeted him politely. She had offered him water before he had even introduced himself. She had answered every question calmly. She had never raised her voice. She had never challenged his authority. Yet he had responded to assumptions instead of facts. The realization settled heavily upon him. It was not simply one mistake. It was the speed with which he had allowed appearances to replace understanding. The body camera attached to his uniform had recorded every second. Ethan suddenly understood that the footage would not only show what Naomi had done, it would also reveal how he had failed to slow down long enough to truly see another human being. Nearby, the local television journalist quietly lowered her camera after finishing another interview. She noticed something changing in Ethan's expression that no headline could fully capture. His confidence had not disappeared. Instead, certainty had given way to humility. It was a transformation almost invisible from a distance, but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. Naomi walked toward him carrying a single unopened bottle of water. Several people nearby instinctively watched, expecting a difficult conversation. Instead, Naomi simply held out the bottle with the same gentle smile she had offered hours earlier. "It is still very hot today," she said. "Please stay hydrated." Ethan looked at the bottle without immediately reaching for it. He seemed almost unable to process such an ordinary act of kindness after everything that had happened. Finally, he accepted it with both hands. "Thank you," he replied quietly, his voice carrying none of the certainty it had held earlier that afternoon. Naomi nodded once before returning to the volunteers without another word. She did not lecture him. She did not remind him of what everyone had witnessed. She understood that genuine reflection could never be forced. It had to grow from within. As a light breeze finally moved through Franklin Square Park, the leaves above rustled softly, offering brief relief from the summer heat. Around them, life continued as children laughed near the fountain, neighbors shared conversations beneath the trees, and volunteers distributed the last cases of bottled water. Yet for Ethan, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Sometimes the loudest lesson arrived without raised voices, and sometimes the deepest change began in a moment of complete silence. 3 days later, the atmosphere inside police headquarters felt noticeably different from its usual routine. The summer sunlight filtered through tall conference room windows, illuminating a long wooden table where department leaders gathered for a scheduled leadership review. Officer Ethan Brooks sat quietly near the end of the room, no longer carrying the quiet confidence that had defined him for years. In front of him rested a tablet displaying the body camera recording from Franklin Square Park. Police Chief Michael Reynolds entered alongside City Manager Rebecca Lawson, followed moments later by Naomi Carter. Several officers looked up in surprise as she walked into the room, not as a complainant seeking punishment, but as the city's newly appointed Executive Director of Community Partnership and Public Trust. She greeted everyone with the same calm smile she had shown at the park, taking her seat without any sign of resentment. Chief Reynolds began the meeting by explaining that the purpose was not to embarrass anyone, but to understand how trust could be strengthened between officers and the communities they served. He pressed a button, and the body camera recording began playing across the large conference screen. The room remained completely silent. Everyone watched Naomi politely offer a bottle of water. They watched Ethan approach with unquestioned certainty. They watched the cooling spray soak the table and scatter the paperwork. Most importantly, they watched Naomi respond with patience instead of anger. When the recording ended, nobody spoke for several long seconds. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the table before finally breaking the silence. "I believed I was making a responsible decision," he said honestly. "But I never stopped long enough to learn who I was speaking to or why she was there. I judged the situation before I understood it. That mistake belongs to me." His voice carried neither excuses nor self-defense. Chief Reynolds nodded slowly before turning toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully, "you have every reason to ask for disciplinary action. Before we continue, I would like to know what outcome you believe best serves this community." Every person in the room shifted their attention toward her. Naomi folded her hands gently on the table before answering. "Respectfully, Chief, I do not believe this community benefits if we spend all of our energy deciding how to punish one person. The greater question is how we prevent this from happening again." She paused briefly before continuing. "Trust is built through thousands of everyday interactions. Every officer meets people they have never seen before. Every citizen hopes to be treated fairly before assumptions are made. If we improve those first moments, we improve everything that follows." Rebecca Lawson smiled quietly, recognizing the same wisdom that had impressed the hiring committee months earlier. Naomi continued, "I would like Officer Brooks to participate in the community listening program we are launching next month. Not because I believe he is beyond redemption, but because I believe meaningful change begins when people are willing to listen before they decide." Ethan slowly looked up, surprised by what he had just heard. He had expected criticism. He had prepared himself for consequences. Instead, the woman he had treated unfairly had offered him an opportunity to grow rather than a reason to fall. The realization settled deeply within him. Respect, he understood for the first time, was never earned by authority alone. It was earned by the willingness to recognize the humanity standing in front of you before reaching any conclusion. Over the following weeks, the listening program Naomi Carter had proposed quietly became one of the most anticipated initiatives in the city. Rather than beginning inside a classroom, she chose to hold the first sessions in neighborhood libraries, community centers, churches, and public parks where residents and officers could meet as neighbors instead of strangers. The goal was remarkably simple. Everyone would have an opportunity to speak, and everyone else would have the responsibility to listen without interruption. Officer Ethan Brooks attended every session. During the first meeting, he arrived early and selected a chair near the back of the room, hoping to avoid unnecessary attention. Instead of introducing him by rank or mentioning the incident at Franklin Square Park, Naomi simply welcomed him the same way she welcomed every participant. "Today we are here to understand experiences before we form opinions," she said. Understanding does not begin with speaking. It begins with listening. The room slowly filled with local business owners, teachers, students, retirees, parents, and several officers from different divisions. One by one, community members shared personal stories about positive encounters, difficult conversations, misunderstandings, and moments when simple kindness had changed their perception of law enforcement. No one raised their voice. No one tried to win an argument. The conversations were thoughtful, respectful, and honest. Ethan listened carefully as an elderly veteran described how one patient officer had once helped him during a medical emergency without making him feel embarrassed. A high school student explained how nervous she became whenever she saw flashing lights behind her family's car, because she feared being judged before anyone knew who they were. A restaurant owner spoke about how regular conversations with neighborhood officers had created friendships that made everyone feel safer. Each story added another perspective Ethan had never fully considered. When it was finally his turn to speak, the room grew quiet. He stood slowly, taking a deep breath before looking around at the people seated before him. "For many years," he began, "I believed experience alone made my decisions reliable. I understand now that experience without humility can become another kind of blind spot. I thought I was protecting the community, but I failed to give one member of that community the respect she deserved before reaching my conclusion. That is something I regret, and it is something I am committed to changing." Nobody applauded immediately. Instead, Several people nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that genuine accountability rarely required dramatic words. Naomi thanked Ethan for his honesty before inviting everyone to continue the discussion in small groups. Throughout the afternoon, officers and residents exchanged stories over coffee, shared ideas for future neighborhood events, and discovered unexpected common ground. Weeks later, the department introduced new communication guidelines emphasizing observation before assumption, conversation before conclusion, and respect during every public interaction. Naomi worked alongside officers as a partner rather than an outsider, helping develop practical training rooted in empathy, professionalism, and mutual trust. Ethan volunteered to assist with future sessions, not because anyone required him to do so, but because he wanted new officers to avoid repeating the mistake that had forever changed his own perspective. The lesson that began beneath the scorching summer sun had grown into something much larger than one difficult afternoon. It had become a reminder that real leadership was measured not by the authority someone carried, but by the willingness to learn, to change, and to treat every person with dignity before making any judgment. 6 months later, Franklin Square Park looked almost exactly as it had on that unforgettable summer afternoon, yet everything that truly mattered had changed. The oak trees still stretched across the walking paths, children still laughed around the fountain, and volunteers once again arranged folding tables filled with cold bottled water as another heat advisory settled over the city. This time, however, the atmosphere carried something new that could not be measured by temperature or seen on any official report. It was trust, built quietly through countless conversations, patient listening, and everyday acts of respect. Naomi Carter arrived early, just as she always had, greeting volunteers by name before helping them organize supplies. She no longer worked behind the scenes as an unknown community organizer. As executive director of the Office of Community Partnership and Public Trust, she now coordinated dozens of neighborhood initiatives across the city, yet her daily routine had remained remarkably unchanged. She still believed leadership began with showing up, carrying boxes, filling coolers, and speaking to people one at a time. A few minutes later, Officer Ethan Brooks walked into the park wearing the same uniform he had worn months earlier, but the person inside that uniform had changed in ways no badge could display. Instead of arriving with hurried assumptions, he stopped at each volunteer station to introduce himself, ask whether anyone needed assistance, and thank them for serving the community during another dangerous heat wave. Several residents recognized him from previous listening sessions and greeted him warmly. Ethan smiled naturally, no longer seeing those conversations as assignments, but as opportunities to understand people whose lives were different from his own. As families gathered around the hydration station, a little girl carrying a bright blue backpack approached the table and reached for a bottle of water. She looked from Naomi to Ethan before asking with complete innocence, "Do you both work together?" Naomi smiled and glanced toward Ethan. Before she could answer, he gently nodded. "Yes," he said, "we do." The little girl handed one bottle to Naomi and another to Ethan before running back toward her parents without realizing how meaningful her simple question had been. Neither titles nor uniforms had mattered to her. She had only seen two adults helping others on a hot summer day. Ethan looked down at the bottle in his hand and quietly laughed to himself. "I almost refused one of these the first time we met," he admitted. Naomi smiled gently. Sometimes people need a second opportunity before they recognize a first impression was incomplete. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for giving me that opportunity." Naomi answered with the same quiet wisdom that had guided every decision she had made throughout the journey. People grow when someone believes they can. The afternoon continued peacefully as volunteers distributed water. Officers helped elderly residents carry supplies to their cars. Children played beneath the cooling mist near the fountain, and neighbors shared conversations beneath the shade of the old oak trees. No speeches were delivered. No cameras waited for dramatic moments. There was only the steady rhythm of ordinary people choosing kindness over judgment, understanding over assumption, and respect over prejudice. As the sun slowly began sinking toward the horizon, golden light reflected across the nearly empty water coolers and the quiet pathways of Franklin Square Park. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves overhead while Naomi and Ethan packed the final folding table together without saying another word. Sometimes justice did not announce itself with celebration. Sometimes it arrived softly, carried in changed hearts, steady hands, and the quiet certainty that one act of compassion could accomplish what anger never could.